Chicago shimmered under the pale gold light of a September morning, the day that carried the whisper of summer's end and the quiet promise of something new. From the 38th floor of the Whitmore Urban Group headquarters, the city stretched out like a living blueprint. Grids of ambition etched in steel and glass, rooftops catching the sun like mirrors, angled toward destiny. Ethan Whitmore adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal blazer, his fingers moving with unconscious precision from decades of routine. At 44, he'd built everything people like him were raised to want: prestige, empire, legacy. Skyscrapers bore his name. Developments across 3 states bowed to his vision. But in recent months, his wins had begun to feel muted. He blamed the fatigue on stress, maybe boredom, or the inevitable dulling that comes with getting what you once dreamed of. What he didn't expect that morning was the soft disruption of Naomi Reed. She entered the boardroom like a chord struck in perfect harmony. Subtle, commanding, and impossible to ignore. No fanfare, just presence. "Good morning," she said, her voice low and clear, with a cadence that hinted at roots not entirely Chicagoan, warmer, richer. There was a trace of New Orleans in the rhythm of her vowels. Her skin was the color of roasted chestnuts kissed by sunlight, her natural curls pulled back in a loose chignon, understated but intentional. A dark emerald blouse paired with wide-leg black trousers made her look elegant without trying. Ethan registered all of it in one calibrated glance. He stood, extending his hand. "Ethan Whitmore." "Naomi Reed," she replied, her handshake firm, her smile precise, not cold, but not offering anything that hadn't been earned. She was there to present a brand strategy for his upcoming South Shore housing initiative, an ambitious project that aimed to bridge luxury development with local community equity. He hadn't expected to be impressed. Most consultants talked in abstractions and buzzwords. He expected well-packaged fluff. But Naomi? She brought clarity. She carved through the noise with only a few slides, and her voice. Her insights were not just accurate. They were nuanced, human. She spoke about generational trust, architectural dignity, and the psychology of home, like someone who wasn't just reading data, but living the implications. Her fingers moved lightly across the remote. Her gaze lingered long enough on each executive to command attention without demanding it. But when she looked at Ethan, she paused slightly, and something imperceptible shifted. He couldn't explain it, even to himself. But he knew, in that fleeting half-second, he had just met someone who would disrupt his carefully built equilibrium. "Questions?" Naomi asked, setting the remote down with quiet finality. There were many. Ethan had memorized every word she'd said, yet his mind was strangely blank. His team clapped. The head of development leaned over and whispered about how they'd struck gold with her. Ethan just nodded slowly, still watching Naomi as she collected her materials. Outside the boardroom, the world resumed its rhythm. Phone calls buzzed. Assistants darted between glass doors. The city throbbed with its usual ambition. But Ethan stood still in a pocket of silence, watching Naomi walk toward the elevator. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. "Margaret," he called, his voice quiet. His assistant appeared beside him in seconds. "Yes, sir. Schedule a follow-up with Ms. Reed's firm. One-on-one. No team." Margaret arched an eyebrow, but didn't question it. She was used to the way he operated. But Ethan knew this wasn't about the operation. It was the beginning of something, and he didn't have a blueprint for the first time in years. Sometimes, the most unforgettable stories begin with a glance, a pause, a feeling you can't quite name. If this moment moved you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Like, follow, and stay with us as Naomi and Ethan's journey unfolds. One heartbeat, one decision, and one impossible love at a time. 3 days later, the lobby of the Langston Tower buzzed with its usual midday pace, professionals darting between meetings, elevators chiming softly, the scent of espresso weaving through the air like a familiar lullaby. Naomi stood in line at the cafe, tucked into the corner of the building's mezzanine, a slim leather folio tucked under her arm. Her eyes scanned the chalkboard menu, but she wasn't reading. She was trying to settle her thoughts. The presentation at Whitmore Urban Group had gone better than expected. No, better than perfect. The proposal had been received with the kind of enthusiasm that usually came laced with caveats, but not this time. Still, there was a weight in her chest she couldn't quite shake off. Something about Ethan Whitmore's silence during the final minutes of that meeting lingered in her mind. He hadn't said much, just watched. And yet she'd felt the scrutiny. Not aggressive, not cold, but deliberate, as if he wasn't evaluating her pitch, but something more profound. "Double espresso, oat milk," she told the barista, then stepped aside. The tap on her shoulder was soft, almost uncertain as she waited. "Ms. Reed?" She turned. He was standing there. Ethan. No assistant, no entourage, no pretense of coincidence. Her lips curved, polite, but unreadable. "Mr. Whitmore." "Ethan," he corrected, his voice low and even. "May I buy your coffee?" She arched a brow. "Already paid." His gaze flicked to the register, then back to her. "Then may I pay for the next one?" She considered the question, the man, the moment. "I suppose that depends," she replied. "Is this professional or personal?" His smile came slowly, almost cautiously. "Does it have to be one or the other?" Naomi didn't answer. The barista called her name, and she stepped forward to retrieve her drink. As she turned, Ethan motioned toward a small table by the window. The sun poured in generously, casting gold across the polished surface. She followed him there, not because she had time, but because something in her wanted to know why he'd come without a meeting. They sat. Silence stretched. Not awkward, just unhurried. She sipped her espresso. He stirred a cup he hadn't yet tasted. "I didn't get to say this in the meeting," Ethan began, "but your presentation wasn't just insightful. It was unsettling." Naomi blinked. "Unsettling?" "In the best way," he clarified. "You didn't just pitch a brand strategy. You challenged the way we see the communities we build in. You made us look at people, not just parcels." Her expression softened just a touch. That was the goal. That was the urban development isn't just architecture. It's memory, belonging, dignity. He nodded. "Exactly. And that's rare. To hear that from someone outside the board." Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You don't seem like someone easily unsettled." Ethan laughed, a quiet, breathy sound. "I don't think I have been. Until recently." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. Something about how he said it, half revealed, half guarded, told her enough. He was a man who lived by structure and precision, yet here he was, deviating from the script. He finally sipped his coffee and set the cup down, as if it didn't taste how he expected. "You strike me as someone who doesn't entertain distractions," Naomi said, her tone cool but not dismissive. "Is that what you think this is?" She met his gaze. "You tell me." Ethan leaned back slightly, his hands folded on the table. "I've spent most of my life choosing what's efficient over what's meaningful. Maybe I'm realizing those two things don't always overlap." For a long moment, Naomi didn't respond. She looked past him, to the city outside, concrete and motion, 1,000 lives happening at once. She had built her own life on clarity, boundaries, and self-reliance. Men like Ethan didn't fit into the compartments she kept carefully aligned. And yet, there was something in the way he looked at her, not as a conquest or a case study, but as someone who just wanted to understand. She stood. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, lifting the nearly empty cup. Ethan rose with her. "Will I see you again?" "You already have my schedule," she replied, voice light but distant. "If anything changes, Margaret will reach out." He watched as she walked away, heels clicking against the polished floor, each step measured, unhurried, resolute. And though she didn't look back, she knew he was still watching. Outside, the sun glinted off the mirrored towers of downtown Chicago. In the reflection, two people had met at a window. One is trying to disrupt a life of predictability. The other is trying not to get pulled into something uncertain. But something had shifted, and neither of them knew it yet. It was supposed to be just coffee, just a conversation, just an acknowledgement of professional respect. But just had never felt so misleading. In the days that followed, Naomi tried to fold the moment neatly into the files of her mind, the ones labeled appropriate, irrelevant, temporary curiosity. But it resisted classification. It tugged at her thoughts in the quiet spaces, while brushing her teeth, waiting for an elevator, walking past the cafe, and catching the smell of dark roast laced with something sweet. It wasn't Ethan himself, she told herself. It was how he had looked. Not at her, but through himself. As if he, too, had forgotten the script. And then came the email. Subject line: follow-up on South Shore branding. The content was precise and measured. An invitation to discuss the next phase integration over lunch. Professional, technically. But there was something in the choice of words. Not sterile, not decorated either. Thoughtful, and intentional. Naomi stared at it for 10 minutes before responding. They met at a small, French Mediterranean bistro, nestled between old brick buildings in River North. His suggestion. She had never eaten there, though she'd passed it many times. Ethan arrived on time, jacket off, sleeves rolled. It made him look younger, or perhaps just less armored. "I hope this place isn't too forward," he said as he pulled out her chair. "It's quiet, and the staff doesn't hover." She nodded, accepting the gesture. "Sounds like you come here often." "I used to," he admitted, then paused, stopped for a while. But today felt like the right day to return. The tablecloths were soft linen, off-white, with the slightest trace of embroidery at the corners. Naomi traced the rim of her water glass with a finger as he studied the menu like it mattered. "What would you recommend?" she asked. Ethan looked up, startled for a second, then amused. "I didn't think you'd ask. Most people order what sounds impressive." "I'm not most people," she said calmly. "No," he murmured. "You're not." They ordered. The conversation drifted from logistics to community impact, then effortlessly lingered on books. She mentioned Baldwin. He brought up Didion. She raised an eyebrow at his reference, and he smiled, not defensively, but playfully, as if challenging her to believe he had layers. "You read Joan Didion?" He shrugged. "I was married once. She left behind bookshelves. Some of it stuck." Naomi didn't press. The word married hung like a forgotten chord, but she let it pass. Instead, she said, "Most men quote her essays without understanding the ache beneath her detachment." Ethan leaned back, impressed. "And you think I do?" "I think," she said, "you're trying to." The server brought wine. Conversation shifted to cities, silence, and the strange loneliness that sometimes clings to success. He spoke about developments like symphonies, concrete as instruments, scaffolding as rhythm. Naomi listened, occasionally interjecting with observations that surprised him, about how neighborhoods breathe differently, depending on who walks through them, how architecture carries memory even when walls are demolished. Their food arrived. Neither of them noticed. Weeks unfolded like chapters read too quickly. Meetings turned into dinners. Dinners turned into walks beneath street lamps that hummed like old jazz records. Naomi kept insisting it was still professional. She clung to that word like armor. But something had shifted between them, subtle as gravity, persistent as heat. Ethan never touched her, not once. But he watched her with a patience that felt almost reverent. He asked questions that lingered in her mind long after they parted. And Naomi, despite herself, began to soften. Still, she kept her boundaries intact. Her apartment was her sanctuary. She never let him pass the threshold. She didn't speak about her father's absence or her mother's warnings about men who admired your strength but didn't understand your softness. She didn't mention the long-ago heartbreak that taught her how to rebuild, quietly, without spectacle. But Ethan wasn't rushing. He wasn't prying. He kept showing up, with his steady eyes and silences that respected hers. One Friday evening, he offered her a ride as they left a meeting with the city housing board. Rain tapped gently against the windshield as his black sedan moved slowly down Lakeshore Drive. Naomi sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes following the dark water outside, each drop of rain sliding across the glass like it had somewhere else to be. "You're hard to read," Ethan said suddenly. Naomi turned, not startled, just curious. "That's by design." He smiled faintly. "I figured. But it's frustrating, you know, wanting to know more, and knowing it's not my place to ask." She didn't reply right away. The city lights glittered in her irises, reflections not quite real. "Most men want access before they've earned trust," she said. You don't push. That's rare." "I push," he admitted. "Just not where I know I'd lose you." Her breath caught slightly. It wasn't a confession. It was a recognition, an acknowledgement that whatever this was, it existed, even if unnamed. When he dropped her off, he didn't ask to come up. He didn't linger. Just looked at her like he had something more to say, then thought better of it. She stepped out into the rain without opening her umbrella, and as she reached her building's entrance, she realized she was smiling. Just barely, but undeniably. This wasn't pursued in the usual sense. There were no declarations, no fireworks, just the quiet insistence of a man willing to wait, not for the right moment, but for her permission to exist in it. Autumn leaned deeper into Chicago, casting long shadows and sharpening the chill in the air. The city had turned copper and gold, and the usually impatient wind moved with an oddly thoughtful stillness. Naomi Reed stood in front of her closet longer than she meant to, one hand trailing over the sleeve of a plum-colored dress she hadn't worn in over a year. She wasn't dressing for a date. It was a dinner. Nothing more. But somehow, she still checked her reflection twice. Ethan had invited her to his place. Not a restaurant, office, neutral ground, his apartment. "You've never let me cook for you," he'd said with a wry half-smile. "It's a tragic imbalance." She had hesitated, but something in his voice, unassuming, quiet, almost hopeful, had made her say yes. Now, as she stepped out of the car and into the private elevator that led to his penthouse in Streeterville, she told herself to remain still, not emotionally, just internally poised, balanced, untouched. The elevator opened to warm light, polished floors, and the smell of something simmering. Olive oil, rosemary, maybe garlic. Jazz filtered softly through speakers hidden in the ceiling. No city skyline theatrics, no display of power or wealth, just a quiet apartment that overlooked Lake Michigan, its windows wide and uncurtained. Ethan emerged from the kitchen in a crisp, untucked button-down, sleeves rolled again, always rolled. It was a detail she was starting to notice, how he only seemed comfortable when his hands were free to move. "You came," he said, not like a man surprised, but like one quietly relieved. "You did say there'd be food," Naomi replied, hanging her coat carefully near the door. "Technically, I said I'd cook," he said, returning to the kitchen. "Whether it qualifies as food remains to be seen." She followed him in, slowly, letting her eyes take in the space. It wasn't sterile, like most places owned by men like him. Some books were not arranged for show, but dog-eared and annotated. A black-and-white photograph of a young boy, Ethan, she guessed, on a beach with someone who looked like his father. And near the window was an old armchair with the fabric slightly worn, where someone had often sat for years. "You live here," she said, more to herself than to him. He turned, holding 2 wine glasses. "You expected—" "What? A glass cube with a view and no soul?" She accepted the glass. "Something like that." Dinner was simple. Roast chicken, rosemary potatoes, sautéed spinach. Nothing fussy, nothing extravagant. But it was real, and warm, and cooked with care that didn't try to impress, just hoped to be shared. They ate at the kitchen island, not the long dining table that loomed like a cathedral to formality. The conversation meandered. She asked about the photo. He told her the story. His father, a carpenter, the smell of sawdust in the garage, how he used to fall asleep to the sound of sandpaper on wood. "You were supposed to be something else, weren't you?" she asked softly. Ethan looked down at his plate. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "I was supposed to build things with my hands. Then my father died, and I built things with money instead." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She just let the silence settle. Sometimes the most honest part of a story was the pause that followed it. He turned the question back to her. "What about you? What were you supposed to be?" She smiled faintly. "A poet. For about 5 minutes when I was 17. Then I realized poets don't always pay rent. So I started studying the language of brands instead." "You still write?" "Only in my head. And only when I can't sleep." Ethan leaned in slightly. "What keeps you up?" Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "People who think they can read me like a slogan." He smiled, slow and unhurried. "Then I won't try." After dinner, they moved to the living room, each settling into opposite corners of the same couch. A record turned on somewhere, Coltrane's saxophone winding its way through the room like smoke. Naomi curled one leg under her, wine glass nestled in her hand, watching the city light flicker beyond the windows. "I've never done this," Ethan said suddenly. She glanced at him. "Cook for someone?" "No." He looked at her, quiet but direct. "Let someone this close without knowing where it's going." Naomi's breath caught in her throat, not because of the words, but how he'd said them. Not dramatic, not performative, just sincere. She set her glass down. "I don't do undefined well," she confessed. "I build walls for a living, Ethan. I call them strategy decks." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then maybe we don't define this. Not yet. Maybe we just let it be what it is." There was a comfort in that, in not needing to name something to feel its presence. When she left, he didn't try to kiss her, didn't reach for her hand. He walked her to the elevator, placed her coat gently over her shoulders, and held the door like it mattered. And as the doors closed between them, Naomi stood very still, heart quiet but aware. It was nothing. but it was beginning to feel dangerously like something. November wrapped Chicago in quiet gray, the kind that dulled the edges of the skyline and turned even the busiest streets into murmurs. It hadn't snowed yet, but the cold had begun to carry a bite, a warning, not yet a punishment. Naomi woke earlier, brewing coffee before the sun even dared rise, as if her thoughts had become restless enough to stir her from sleep. She hadn't seen Ethan in a week. It wasn't a deliberate pause. Life had gotten loud again. Deadlines, stakeholder meetings, the unexpected rush of end-of-year obligations. But even in the rhythm of her days, she felt his absence like a note missing from a familiar melody. Subtle, persistent. Her phone buzzed late Thursday evening as she finished final edits for a campaign pitch. From Ethan. "Do you ever stop working?" She stared at the message momentarily, a slow smile tugging at the corners of her lips. From Naomi. "Do you ever stop watching?" His reply came quickly. "Only long enough to notice when I'm not being seen." She paused, reread it. The words were simple, but something in their weight made her inhale a little deeper. That weekend, they met again. Not at his place. Not in a meeting room. At the Art Institute. Ethan had suggested it without preamble. "Meet me by the Bronze Lions. Noon." She had agreed, surprised by how naturally she said yes. It wasn't a date. Not really. There had been no talk of romance, no labels, no assumptions. And yet, something about him asking her to meet him among paintings and stillness made her feel he was asking to be understood in a new language. He was waiting when she arrived, hands in coat pockets, scarf slightly crooked, eyes scanning the crowd with a softness that seemed foreign to him outside these private moments. "You came," he said again, always that phrase, as if he still couldn't quite believe she would. Naomi gestured toward the museum's steps. "You picked the exhibit." They wandered through the Impressionists first. Naomi lingered before a Degas painting of dancers, bodies in mid-motion, yet caught forever in a still frame. "I used to dance," she murmured. Ethan turned to her. "You?" She nodded. "Ballet. For 10 years. It taught me how to hold pain without showing it." He didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He just said, "I believe you." They moved on. To Chagall. To Hopper. To Rothko. And somewhere between the blue windows of American windows and the weighted silences of Nighthawks, something shifted. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But in the way they began to stand closer, their conversations wandered further from the surface. Ethan told her about his mother, how she had stayed in their house long after his father passed, as if time could be paused through ritual. He had begged her to leave, downsize, and come live closer, but she never did. She said people are like plants, he said. Uproot them, and they wilt. Naomi nodded slowly. But not everyone gets to choose their soil. He looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. No, they don't. Later, over lunch at a corner cafe with fogged-up windows and chipped mugs, they shared pieces they hadn't before. Naomi talked about her brother and how he'd been her anchor until he left for the Navy and never quite came back the same. She spoke about the years she spent learning to be strong and invisible, how silence became armor in rooms filled with power. "You don't seem invisible to me," Ethan said quietly. "That's because you're not trying to own the room," she replied. "You're just in it." He was quiet for a long time. "Maybe I'm tired of ownership." The words were simple, but settled between them like a fragile truth. He didn't leave the car when he dropped her off later that evening. There was no reaching, no grasping, just a pause, his eyes on her, her hand on the door. Naomi hesitated, fingers curled around the handle. "You feel it too, don't you?" Ethan asked, voice barely audible. She didn't turn to him. just kept her gaze forward, watching the streetlight flicker across wet pavement. "I feel something," she said. It wasn't coy. It wasn't cruel. It was the closest she could get to honesty without surrender. She set her keys inside her apartment, kicked off her heels, and stood in the dark. No music, no lights, just the sound of her breath. It would have been easier if he were like the others, predictable, performative, content with surface. But Ethan asked nothing, promised nothing, and still managed to leave her more exposed than she liked. She walked to the window, pressed her palm against the glass, and stared into the night. There was a question hovering somewhere between them, and neither of them was ready to answer it. But it was there, undeniable, growing. The first snow arrived on a Monday. Not a heavy theatrical flurry, but a quiet dusting. Fine, white powder settling on rooftops and softening the hard lines of the city. It came without warning, like a secret whispered against Chicago's skin, and for a moment, even the honking horns and restless traffic seemed to hush in its presence. Naomi stood by her office window, a steaming cup of jasmine tea in her hands. Below, the city moved as always. But up here, on the 27th floor, it felt like time had folded in on itself. She hadn't seen Ethan in almost 2 weeks. Not because they had fought. Not because anything had gone wrong. But because nothing had. And that, in itself, had felt terrifying. She had always believed in balance, in boundaries, in logic. Her world was a blueprint. Meetings, deadlines, calculated risks. But lately, there had been moments, tiny cracks in her careful structure, where she found herself waiting for something she couldn't name. A message, a thought, a presence. Ethan. And when nothing came, she had told herself it was for the best. Until today. Her assistant knocked gently on the glass door. "Ms. Reed, you have a visitor." Naomi turned, brows arching. "Scheduled?" "He said it's personal," the assistant replied, her expression unreadable. "But respectful." Naomi nodded slowly. "Send him in." She didn't need to ask who it was. Ethan stepped into her office a moment later, his coat still dusted with snow, his expression cautious but composed. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her like he wasn't sure if he should be here. Naomi set down her tea. "You're a long way from your boardroom." "I needed air," he said. "And clarity." She gestured to the chair across her desk. But he didn't sit. "I didn't come for a meeting," he said, his voice quiet. "I came because silence started to feel dishonest." Naomi folded her arms. "Go on." Ethan hesitated. "I think I was falling into something with you." Slowly, carefully, but still, falling. She exhaled, slow and measured. "And now you're not?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I just know that the longer we dance around it, the more it feels like we're avoiding something we both already feel." Naomi walked around her desk and leaned against the edge, arms still crossed. Her posture was calm, but her heartbeat betrayed her. "Why now?" she asked. "Why today?" He shrugged, almost helplessly. "Because it snowed. And I remembered something you said, about dancers holding pain without showing it, and I realized I've been doing the same. Not pain, but restraint, out of respect, out of fear, out of habit." She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him. Ethan took a step closer. "I'm not asking for anything tonight. No declarations, no decisions. I just wanted to stand in your room and not pretend anymore." Naomi finally looked away, her gaze falling to the floor. I don't trust this, she said quietly. Not because of you, but because of what it could take from me if it disappears. I understand, he said. No, I don't think you do, she replied, more sharply than she meant to. I've built everything I have from the ground up, every choice, every boundary. And when someone like you steps in, someone who doesn't push, who listens, it confuses everything. He nodded slowly. Then maybe I'm here to confuse you. She laughed once, softly, involuntarily. It broke the tension for a beat long enough for her to breathe again. They stood there in the stillness, not touching, not closing the space, just acknowledging it. Have dinner with me, he said finally. I can't, she replied, almost instantly. Because you're busy? No, she said, because I'm not ready. Ethan accepted that without question. Then I'll wait. But I won't disappear. She looked up and met his eyes. I don't want you to disappear, she admitted. His smile was small but real. Good. And then he left, quietly, without lingering. That night, Naomi walked home instead of taking a car. The snow had thickened, but remained gentle, blanketing the city in white, as if trying to give it a second chance. She passed a bookstore and paused at the window. Inside, someone was reading aloud. An open mic night, perhaps. She couldn't hear the words, but the reader's posture said enough. Vulnerable, honest, unfiltered. She stood there a long time. Something had shifted again. But this time, she didn't resist it. She just let it fall with the snow, soft, steady, and inevitable. By mid-December, the city had sunk into its winter hush. Cars moved slower, lights stayed on longer, and the cold seemed to carry a stillness that no amount of noise could quite penetrate. Naomi had always liked winter, but not for the obvious reasons. She liked how honest it made people. No one could pretend to be unaffected in the cold. It stripped everyone down to warmth, shelter, and proximity, and silence. That week, she was in more meetings than usual, clients wanting to wrap up before the holidays, teams pushing for final approvals, vendors whispering about bonuses and late invoices. The elevator rides were filled with small talk and stiff smiles. But her mind kept returning to Ethan. His visit, his words, the quiet gravity of his presence in her office. He hadn't followed up. He hadn't needed to. The memory of him had lingered like a breath she couldn't quite exhale. It was Thursday afternoon when it happened. She was reviewing a strategy deck for a luxury housing development in Bronzeville when her phone buzzed. Once, then again. Naomi rarely checked personal messages during work hours, but something nudged her. From Ethan. I'm sending a car. If you say no, it'll just circle the block until it runs out of gas. She stared at the message for a long beat. From Naomi. Where? His reply came seconds later. Somewhere warm, somewhere old, somewhere with answers. Cryptic, infuriating. And yet, she texted back a simple, fine. By 6 o'clock, the black SUV awaited her outside the office. No driver spoke, just opened the door, handed her a wool blanket, and nodded politely. They drove through the city, past the high-rises and the lakefront, past Lincoln Park, until the skyline faded and the streets took on the character of memory. Worn buildings with paint peeling just slightly, lampposts that flickered not out of design, but age. The car pulled up to a 2-story brownstone in Humboldt Park. Naomi stepped out cautiously, scanning the street, the windows, and the unfamiliarity of everything. The front door opened before she could knock. Ethan stood in the frame, sleeves rolled, hair slightly windblown, eyes uncertain, but open. I didn't mean to be dramatic, he said. You never mean to be anything, she replied, stepping inside. The house smelled like wood polish and faint cologne, but more than anything, it smelled like memory. Old photographs lined the hallway, black and white portraits, holiday snapshots, faded school pictures. Naomi followed him into the living room, where a small fire crackled in the old stone hearth. "Whose house is this?" she asked. "My mother's," he said. "Well, was." Naomi turned slowly. "You never said." "She passed last year," he said softly. "Breast cancer. She didn't want a funeral. She said if people didn't say kind things to her while she was alive, they didn't get to say them after." Naomi folded her arms, unsure what to do with her hands, her empathy, her suddenly thudding heart. "I come here sometimes," Ethan continued, "to remember her, and to remember myself." She nodded, still silent. He led her to a small study at the back of the house, bookshelves full of cookbooks, mysteries, and dusty encyclopedias. On the desk was a box, unsealed. "I found this last week," he said, nudging it gently. "Letters she wrote to me. She never gave them to me while she was alive, just left them here." Naomi reached out, fingertips brushing the edge of one envelope. "You want me to read them?" "No," he said. "I want you to understand something about me. I grew up in this house. I learned how to be silent in this house. Thoughtful, practical, but never expressive. My father built furniture. My mother built walls. We all survived by being useful." She looked at him, then looked. The polished man, the strategist, who cooked without asking for praise and stood in rooms like he belonged, but never demanded to be the center of them. "And now?" she asked. "I don't want to survive you," he said. "I want to know you, and I don't know how, unless I let you see the parts of me that aren't seamless." For a long while, neither of them spoke. The fire hissed. A clock ticked somewhere down the hall. Finally, Naomi said, "I was 8 when my father left. My mother used to sit in the kitchen and cut coupons for hours, even when she didn't need to. She said it kept her hands busy, so her heart wouldn't crack open." Ethan took a slow breath. "And did it work?" "No," Naomi said, but it made her believe she could manage the pain. Some people need something to hold. Ethan moved then, not toward her, but beside her. He didn't reach for her hand, just stood close enough that she could feel his warmth. "What do you hold?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, very softly, she said, "Doubt." Ethan nodded. "Then let me be the thing that doesn't ask to be held. Just noticed." They stood like that for minutes, maybe more. Two people in a quiet house, neither of them rescuing the other, neither of them retreating. Just two people surrounded by ghosts and warmth and the quiet possibility of something that might one day have a name. When she finally left, Naomi walked into the night without speaking. But as she slid into the waiting car and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, she realized she felt less cold and less alone. Snow clung stubbornly to the corners of the city now, no longer the pristine white of a postcard, but the softened gray of something that had stayed too long. December in Chicago had a way of turning even the boldest into something more reflective. Voices hushed, footsteps careful, eyes lingering longer on windows lit from the inside. Naomi was no exception. Since the night at Ethan's mother's house, something had shifted. Not in loud, declarative ways, but in the quiet spaces between movement. She went about her routines, morning meetings, coffee runs, client calls, but a part of her, always, was elsewhere, hovering in the warmth of a firelit study, tracing the memory of Ethan's voice as he spoke about the woman who raised him, feeling the weight of a truth shared without being demanded. She hadn't spoken to him since that evening, not out of avoidance, but preservation. The moment had been too real to dilute with texts. It is too intimate to follow up with something as small as, "Hope you're well." Instead, she let it sit. Let it breathe. Let herself breathe. But breathing didn't mean forgetting. That Friday, after her final meeting, Naomi stepped out into the street without her usual rush. The cold air kissed her face, tugged at her scarf, but she didn't pull it tighter. She just walked past the crowd spilling out of office towers, past the city's holiday decorations, and the faint sound of jazz leaking from a corner cafe. Without thinking, she found herself back in Streeterville. She paused across the street from Ethan's building, unsure why she was there and what she hoped to see. The lights were on in his apartment. She could make out the silhouette of someone moving past the window. Slow, deliberate, familiar, but she didn't go up. She stood momentarily, then turned away, letting the city swallow her again. Ethan was in the middle of stirring a pot of butternut squash soup when his phone buzzed. From Naomi. "What's the one dish you always make when trying not to feel lonely?" He read the message twice, the corners of his mouth tilting upward. Not quite a smile, more like recognition. From Ethan. This one. A pause. Then another message. "Come, have some. You don't have to talk. Just bring your silence." 10 minutes later, there was a knock. He opened the door, and there she was. Her cheeks pink from the cold, her coat still dusted with snow, her expression unreadable, but not closed. "I brought wine," she said, holding up a bottle of something red and expensive. "You brought silence too?" he asked. She stepped inside without answering. The apartment was warm and low-lit, music playing softly in the background, something instrumental, melancholy but elegant. Naomi moved to the kitchen counter, watching Ethan ladle the soup into 2 bowls, his movements unhurried, precise. They ate on the island again. No candles, no table settings, just 2 people leaning over warm bowls, sharing space. For a while, there was only the clink of spoons against ceramic, the occasional exhale, the music stretching between them like a thread. Then Naomi spoke. "I don't know how to be in something that doesn't ask for pieces of me I can't afford to lose." Ethan set down his spoon, but didn't interrupt. She looked at him, eyes sharp but not unkind. "You don't pressure. You don't push. And that makes you dangerous." He tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "Because I don't know what you want," she said. "And that makes me feel things I didn't plan for." Ethan considered that for a moment, then said, "Maybe I don't want to want anything. Maybe I want to notice." She exhaled slowly, fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he said, "but it's honest." They didn't speak again for a while, just sat in the warm hush of the room, letting the silence fold over them like a blanket neither of them asked for, but both needed. After dinner, Ethan poured more wine, and they moved to the couch. Not opposite ends this time, just close enough for warmth, not enough to touch. Naomi looked around. "You don't decorate for Christmas?" He shook his head. "Not really. It never felt like mine." She nodded. "Me neither." He glanced at her, something thoughtful in his gaze. "I keep thinking about the night we met, that first dinner. You were so composed. Everything about you said, 'Don't get close.'" "I was trying to protect my edges," she said softly. "And now?" Naomi looked at him, her voice quiet. "Now I don't know where the edges are anymore." That admission sat between them, weightless but heavy. Then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan reached for her hand. Not in a declaration, not an assumption, just an offering. And Naomi didn't pull away. She didn't leap into his arms. She didn't cry. She didn't confess. She let their hands rest together, palms touching, fingers not yet intertwined. The snow outside thickened. The city slowed. And somewhere, in the quiet between words and warmth, something fragile and profound took root. Not yet love, not yet forever. But something is true. Something neither of them dared name. Not yet. Christmas crept closer, not in fanfare, but in fragments. The smell of cinnamon drifting from bakery windows, the soft hum of carols beneath the clatter of trains, the faint glimmer of fairy lights reflected in wet pavement. Chicago was glowing, but not loudly. It was the kind of holiday hush that settled in the bones, making everything feel suspended, half remembered, half expected. One evening, Naomi stood by her window, watching the snow fall in thick, deliberate flakes. Her building overlooked a quiet corner of the Gold Coast, where the lake wind softened just enough to let winter linger. In her hands was a mug of hot tea, untouched. On her phone, a message she hadn't sent. "Are you spending the holiday alone?" She typed it, deleted it, typed again, then let the screen go dark. Because it wasn't the question that scared her. It was what came after. She hadn't seen Ethan in over a week. Not since the night they shared soup and silence. Since her hand, almost instinctively, found his and didn't let go. Since the warmth of that moment threatened to undo the carefully built scaffolding around her heart. It wasn't that he had pulled away. It was that he hadn't chased. And in that, he honored her space in a way few ever had, and in doing so, made her miss him even more. On Christmas Eve morning, Naomi received a package. No note, no sender listed, just her name, written in the clean, slanted handwriting she knew belonged to Ethan. Inside, a worn book of essays by James Baldwin, dog-eared, underlined, pages softened by time, and on the title page, a single line in ink. For when silence is too loud, but words still feel like trespass. She read that line 10 times, then closed the book and stared at it like it had just said something she wasn't ready to hear. That night, she visited her mother. They sat across from each other in the same sun-warmed kitchen where Naomi had once watched a woman fold grief into casseroles and quiet. The small apartment still smelled like nutmeg and cloves, and someone crooned about snow and lovers and miracles on the radio. "Do you ever miss him?" Naomi asked suddenly. Her mother paused, knife hovering over a half-sliced yam. "Your father?" Naomi nodded. Her mother set the knife down and wiped her hands slowly. "Sometimes, but not in the way people think." "What way, then?" "I miss the version of myself I was with him, before the disappointments, before the silence." She looked up, eyes wise but not bitter. People think heartbreak is about losing someone, but sometimes it's about losing who you were willing to be for them. Naomi didn't speak. Her throat ached with unsaid things. Later that evening, her mother kissed her forehead and cupped her face like she was still a girl. "You've always been brave, Naomi, but there's a difference between being brave enough to be alone and being brave enough to be seen." Back in her apartment, the Baldwin book sat on the coffee table, untouched since morning. She picked it up again and flipped to a random page. A sentence leapt out at her. "Love takes off masks that we fear we cannot live without, and know we cannot live within." She closed the book slowly and called him. It rang once, then twice. Then, Naomi. He didn't say hello, just her name. And somehow, it felt more intimate than any greeting. "I got your gift," she said. "I hoped you would." "You annotated Baldwin?" He chuckled softly. The college version of me was either in love with language or terrified of silence. Probably both. A beat passed. Then she asked, "What are you doing tonight?" "Listening to Ella Fitzgerald, sitting by a fire that's more aesthetic than functional." "You?" Regretting not asking that question a week ago. He was quiet. Then gently, "Come over." She hesitated. "You're sure?" "I'm only sure about one thing lately," he said, "and it's you." She arrived half an hour later. He opened the door in a navy sweater and bare feet, the air behind him thick with the scent of cedarwood and the echo of music from a vintage speaker. He didn't reach for her, didn't fill the silence. Just let her step inside. Let her choose. Naomi walked in, shrugging off her coat, setting it on the arm of his leather chair. "I've never done this," she murmured. "What's this?" he asked. "Come to someone on a night that's supposed to belong to tradition, to memory." Ethan poured her a glass of red and handed it over without a flourish. "Then let's make this a memory worth keeping." They sat by the fire, not touching and not performing, just existing in the same room, the kind of silence felt earned rather than awkward. At some point, Naomi looked over at him. "Why me?" she asked, not with insecurity, but genuine curiosity. Ethan looked at her like she was the only question worth answering. "Because you don't let people get away with pretending," he said. "Not even yourself. And when I look at you, I don't feel I need to perform anything. Not grief, not strength, not certain." Her chest tightened, not from pain, but from recognition. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered. "Neither do I," he said, "but I want to find out with you." They didn't kiss. They didn't fall into each other's arms like some scripted fairy tale. They just sat there, two people who had spent most of their lives protecting themselves from precisely this moment, and now, without armor, choosing not to run. Outside, snow fell again, but inside, everything felt warm for the first time in a long time, and possible. Morning arrived gently, without the clang of alarms or the pull of obligation. Light filtered through the gauzy curtains of Ethan's apartment, turning the hardwood floors into watercolor strokes of gold and shadow. Naomi opened her eyes slowly, unsure of where she was, until the scent of cedar and coffee pulled her back into the present. She hadn't meant to fall asleep there. They hadn't planned to share a bed. And technically, they hadn't. The couch had been wide, and their conversation had stretched late into the night, wandering through childhood memories, lost holidays, and the names of constellations neither could quite remember. At some point, her head had slipped against his shoulder. At some point after that, he had draped a blanket over them both and turned off the lamp without waking her. As she sat up and rubbed sleep from her eyes, Naomi felt none of the panic she usually associated with vulnerability. No need to rush, to retreat, to explain. Just stillness, and a curious kind of peace. The apartment was quiet, but not empty. She could hear Ethan in the kitchen, the soft clink of ceramic, and the rhythmic hiss of something simmering. She rose, folding the blanket neatly before walking toward the sound. He looked up as she entered, offering a soft smile without comment. He was barefoot again, always barefoot at home, she realized, and dressed in a faded gray t-shirt and jeans that hung low on his hips. He looked like Sunday morning. "You're an early riser," she murmured. "I'm a bad sleeper," he replied. "Habit of waking up with thoughts that won't stay put." "What were you thinking about this morning?" He handed her a mug of black coffee, just how she liked it. You, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Dangerous territory for this early. He chuckled. It wasn't a dramatic thought. Just quiet. You asleep beside me felt like something that had always been supposed to happen. Like some part of my life caught up to itself. Naomi didn't answer. She took a sip of coffee and leaned against the counter, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. Ethan turned back to the stove, flipping pancakes onto 2 plates. I hope you're not allergic to comfort food. I grew up on it, she said, but only on Sundays. My mom called it her gentle rebellion. 1 day a week where we didn't count calories or pennies. Smart woman. She had to be, Naomi said, more quietly. They ate at the breakfast bar again, knees brushing under the counter, laughter spilling more easily than it had the night before. And yet, underneath it all, Naomi felt something ticking, slow, inevitable. Reality. Because what they were building, if they were creating anything, still lived outside the edges of definition. There had been no conversations about expectations, no mention of the new year, just days away. No question of what came next. And that silence, as tender as it had been, was beginning to ache. She set her fork down. I need to ask something, she said. Ethan looked up, instantly attentive. This, whatever this is, are you building it on something real? Or just reacting to the quiet between us? His brow furrowed, but he didn't flinch. I'm not sure I understand. She inhaled. I've been in situations where chemistry was mistaken for compatibility, where intimacy stood in for intention. I need to know, are you just comforted by the idea of me? Or are you choosing me, deliberately? Ethan was silent for a long moment, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was weighing his words with the kind of care that made her heart ache a little. I think I've spent most of my adult life confusing stillness with safety, he said at last. You bring me stillness, but not because you disappear into the background. It's the opposite. You make space feel sharper, clearer. I feel more alive around you, Naomi, not less. And yes, I'm choosing you, not as a reaction, but as a decision. Her throat tightened. That's a beautiful answer, she said. But I'm not ready for it. He nodded, unoffended. Okay. Naomi looked down at her hands, ashamed of how quickly her chest had filled with self-defense. It's not about you, she whispered. It's about how long I've had to carry myself alone. Sometimes when someone finally offers to help, it doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a threat to my independence. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the counter. I'm not here to take anything from you, he said, least of all your strength. The words settled between them. She stood slowly, walking toward the window. Outside, the city looked unbothered by any of this. Cars slid down icy roads. Someone bundled in red carried a Christmas tree too large for their frame. The world kept moving. And maybe, she thought, so should she. She turned back to Ethan, soft but certain. I think I need to go. He didn't protest. He stood there too, walking her to the door like it was the most natural thing in the world. At the threshold, he didn't kiss her, didn't ask her to stay. He just said, call me when your fear gets quieter. She met his eyes. And if it never does, then I'll understand, he said, but I'll still wish it had. She stepped into the cold, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the chill because of winter. She felt it because of what she'd left behind. New Year's Eve arrived like a whisper. Naomi didn't invite. Downtown Chicago shimmered in preparation. Gold banners in storefronts, glimmering strings of light in tree branches, strangers bustling with champagne in paper bags. The streets pulsed with an energy Naomi used to crave in her 20s, nights spent chasing distraction, sound, motion, anything that could drown out the stillness that always followed her home. But this year, she didn't want noise, or glitter, or a room full of people yelling numbers into the air like a promise. She wanted quiet, but not the kind that isolated. No, the kind that knew how to hold something without breaking it. The kind Ethan had offered her, and in fear, she had turned from. Her apartment was dimly lit, a candle flickering low on the table beside the armchair she hadn't sat in for days. The Baldwin book lay open on her lap, but her eyes hadn't moved from the same line in over 20 minutes. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Naomi closed the book, breathing out. Outside her window, fireworks began early, test runs or eager hearts unwilling to wait until midnight. Bursts of color lit the clouds in soft hues of violet and orange. And yet, inside her, everything stayed grayscale. She stood, pacing slowly to her bookshelf, running her fingertips along the spines, not searching, just touching. She did this when her mind needed grounding, when her thoughts blurred the line between past and possible. And then, without deciding to, she pulled her coat from the hook by the door. She didn't check the mirror, didn't put on lipstick, didn't text him. She just walked. The streets hummed with celebration, but Naomi kept to the quieter blocks. Snow melting into slush along the curbs, soft jazz bleeding out of open windows. Her breath hung in the air like something unsent. By the time she reached Ethan's building, it was nearly 11:30. She didn't press the buzzer. Instead, she just stood across the street, watching his window, the faint silhouette of him moving inside, alone. Her feet felt heavy. Her palms were cold. Her heart was somewhere between impulse and intention. She turned to leave. And then she heard him. "Naomi?" Her eyes widened. He was standing at the top of the stoop, with no coat, sweater sleeves pushed to his forearms, and eyes full of something that could have been surprise, but wasn't. It was something older, softer, familiar. She swallowed. "I wasn't going to ring, but you came." She nodded. "I didn't want to end the year in fear." He didn't speak. Didn't move, just looked at her the way someone does when they're afraid reaching out might undo everything, but not reaching might undo them even more. Naomi took a step forward, then another, until she was standing on the bottom step and looking up at him. "I'm not promising anything," she said. "I'm not asking you to," he replied. "I'm still going to run sometimes. I'll be here when you stop." She laughed, barely. "That's an awful lot of patience." "It's not patience," he said. "It's hope." He reached out then, not to pull her, not to grip, but to offer. Just a hand, just warmth. She took it. They didn't go upstairs right away. They sat on the stoop like teenagers, he in his socks, her hands wrapped in his coat, sharing silence while the city counted down without them. When the clock struck midnight, they heard the shouts from blocks away, fireworks echoing between high-rises, distant music, laughter spilling out into alleyways. But they stayed still. And then, finally, she asked, "Aren't you going to kiss me?" Ethan looked at her. His voice was low and deliberate. "Not until you want to be kissed." Naomi turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What if I already do?" He didn't lean in. He waited. Let her close the distance herself. And when she did, when their lips met, it wasn't the firework kind of kiss. It didn't crackle or explode. It settled, like an exhale, like something that had been holding its breath for far too long. Later, they would go inside. Later, she would fall asleep on his chest, barefoot and unafraid. But for now, on a cold Chicago stoop, beneath a sky littered with ash and celebration, they kissed like they were building something, not finishing it. And for the first time in years, Naomi didn't feel like she was standing at the edge of something she might lose. She felt like she had arrived. January unfolded with a quiet kind of grace. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. There was no cinematic swell of music, no passionate declarations whispered into cold morning air. Instead, it was how Naomi knew Ethan liked his tea, strong, with a hint of honey, no milk. He hummed when concentrating was low and off-key, mostly jazz standards, the way he let silence exist between them without rushing to fill it. Their intimacy didn't erupt. It gathered, in slow, steady pulses. They weren't living together, but her presence in his apartment became a soft fixture. A second toothbrush appeared beside his. A silk scarf was forgotten on the back of his chair. A jar of almond butter she preferred, placed in his pantry beside the things she would never eat, but that somehow made the shelves feel more like home. Ethan never commented on any of it. He just let it happen. He never once asked for more than she was ready to give. And because of that, Naomi gave more than she expected. Not all at once, but in tiny offerings. Sunday breakfasts made from scratch. A playlist she made him just because. The story of her first heartbreak, told on a rainy Tuesday, when neither of them felt like pretending the world outside mattered. Still, some parts of her stayed guarded. Not out of mistrust, but habit. It was easier to speak about her clients, meetings, and thoughts on city politics than to let him see the tangled knots she still hadn't unraveled. She never said the words she sometimes felt pressing at the back of her throat. Words like need, stay, or please don't leave before I learn how to ask you not to. Ethan, for his part, never pressed. But she knew he noticed. It was a Thursday evening when the thread finally tugged. They were walking home from a gallery opening. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet collection of black female painters being honored in a tucked-away space in River North. Naomi had cried, subtly, in front of a portrait that reminded her of her grandmother. Ethan took her hand, said nothing, and held it as they walked through the rest of the exhibit. Now, bundled in scarves and winter coats, they walked side by side through the nearly empty streets, the air brittle with cold, but not unfriendly. Ethan glanced at her. "You went quiet back there." She smiled faintly. "It's hard to talk when something cracks you open." He nodded, letting that settle. Then, "Do you think you'll ever show your work again?" Naomi stopped walking. They hadn't talked about her art, not directly. He knew she painted, had seen the canvases stacked in her apartment corner, never framed, never hung. But she'd never explained why. "I don't know," she said slowly. "Painting was always personal, sacred even. They tried to name it once I started letting people look at it, define it. Suddenly it wasn't mine anymore." Ethan watched her. "But it is yours." She looked away. "It doesn't feel that way now." A pause stretched between them. Then Ethan spoke, carefully. "You've spent so much of your life protecting what's sacred to you, Naomi, and I respect that. But sometimes I wonder if you're protecting yourself from the wrong things." She turned back to him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if the danger isn't in people seeing your truth, but in you never letting anyone close enough to hold it with you?" Her breath caught. It didn't feel like criticism, not because he was wrong, but because he had said it so gently. It felt like a hand extended in the dark. She didn't answer him. Not then. They finished the walk silently, her fingers cold inside her gloves. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, Ethan's words looping in her head like an echo she couldn't turn off. Her apartment felt foreign, and the rooms were still too. She found herself reaching for her phone, typing, deleting. Finally, she opened her laptop and pulled out one of her unfinished digital canvases. It was abstract, blues and ochres layered over bold lines, jagged brush strokes, chaos, and order fighting for dominance. She worked on it until nearly dawn, losing herself in the color, in the surrender. And when she finished, she saved it not as untitled, but under a single name, Held. Ethan found her waiting the following evening on the steps outside his building. He blinked, surprised, but only briefly. She stood as he approached, wind brushing the curls from her face. "I brought something," she said, lifting a canvas wrapped in brown paper. His brows lifted. "Is that what I think it is?" "It's one of the first things I ever painted," Naomi said, voice steady. "It's messy, a little raw, but it's mine, and I want you to have it." Ethan took it with both hands, reverent. "You sure?" She nodded. "You asked me once if I'd ever show my work again. The answer is no." He blinked. She smiled. "Not publicly, but I'll show it to you." And that, more than any gallery, any exhibit, felt like trust. They didn't need more words after that. Not that night. He invited her in with a look, and she followed without hesitation. Later, as she lay wrapped in his arms, sleep pulling at the edges of her thoughts, she whispered the one thing she hadn't dared say before. "I'm scared of how much I feel for you." Ethan's voice was a soft hush in the dark. "Me too." But neither of them moved away, because some things, once seen, can't be hidden again. And sometimes, love doesn't ask for clarity. It just asks to be held. February arrived like a half-forgotten promise, gray and uneven, with more rain than snow, more silence than celebration. The kind of month that tested what was real beneath the ritual. No more holidays, no more glittering distractions. Just the daily rhythm of life and how it either settled you or unmoored you. For Naomi, it did both. She had started waking up in Ethan's apartment more often than not. Not out of routine or obligation, but because waking there felt easier. Like the world didn't press down so heavily when sunlight filtered through his windows. Her body adjusted to his rhythms, the way he stretched every morning before touching his phone, the quiet whistle he made while boiling water, and his habit of kissing her temple without realizing it. But comfort had a way of making the past stir, and Naomi's past didn't like being ignored. It showed up one Thursday as she scrolled through her inbox after a late client call, an unexpected name, folded between newsletters and marketing spam. Jared Timmons. She stared at it for a long minute before opening it. "Saw your profile on the firm's new website. Looks like you're doing well. Thought about you this week. Hope you're good, Naomi." There were no attachments, no apologies, just his name, short and sharp as she remembered it. The man she had once almost married. The man who taught her how love could be manipulated under the guise of care, who called her difficult when she asked for space and cold when she gave it. The man who didn't hit, but bruised her just the same, with his silence, his dismissals, his slow erosion of her sense of worth. She deleted the email, emptied the trash, closed her laptop, but it stayed with her. The words, the history, the echo. Ethan noticed immediately. He didn't ask, not that night. He made dinner, let her be quiet, allowing her to rest her head on his chest and say nothing. He didn't ask the next morning when she left early for a meeting. She hadn't told him about the day before. But by the time Saturday came, and they found themselves walking along the lakefront path, wind sharp against their faces, He finally said, "Where did you go this week?" Naomi looked at him, surprised by the phrasing. "I was here," she said softly. "No," he replied. "You weren't." There was no accusation in his tone, only knowing. She stopped walking. "I got an email," she said. "From someone who hurt you," he guessed. She nodded once. "Years ago. But it's strange. When I saw his name, my chest tightened like I was 24 again, explaining why I wasn't too ambitious, still folding myself to fit into someone's idea of what softness should look like." Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for her hand, warming it in his. "I wish I could erase that part of your memory," he said. "But I can't. I can only remind you you're not there anymore." Naomi looked down at their joined hands. "I know. Whenever I think I've healed, something reminds me that healing isn't always linear. It loops and spirals. And then I hate that it still affects me." "You're allowed to feel affected," she exhaled. "Sometimes I wish I didn't feel anything." He smiled. "Then you wouldn't be you." They kept walking, quiet again. When they returned to his apartment, Naomi didn't go straight to the kitchen or the couch. She walked into his study instead, a rarely entered space, and stood before the piano against the far wall. It was polished, well kept, and played often. "Will you play something?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. "I haven't played in front of anyone in a long time. I haven't painted for anyone in a long time either," she replied. "And yet here we are." He sat down on the bench, hands hovering above the keys. "What do you want to hear?" "Something that sounds like the inside of your chest," she said. Ethan didn't laugh at the request. He just closed his eyes and began. The music that followed was quiet, full of unfinished phrases, minor keys, moments that stumbled before resolving. It wasn't flawless, but it was honest, the kind of sound that bled without asking permission. Naomi sat on the floor and listened, and when he finished, she whispered, "I've never loved like this before." Ethan didn't turn. He just answered, "Me neither." It wasn't a confession meant to change anything, not a demand or a declaration, just a truth spoken into a room that now carried more than air. They sat in the hush of that honesty, neither rushing to fill it. Because some love stories aren't built with crescendos and fireworks. Some are composed in minor notes, gentle hands, and the courage to sit beside someone while their past breathes through them. And that night, Naomi dreamed not of escape, but of staying. Of the soft click of a piano key. Of two people learning to speak a language with no sharp edges. The following weeks unfolded like a slow dance, the rhythm shifting with every step taken, every silence held between them. Naomi and Ethan navigated the fragile terrain of their budding relationship, not with grand gestures or sweeping promises, but with small moments of bravery stitched together by trust. It was a Tuesday morning when Naomi finally invited Ethan into the sacred corners of her world, the space she had kept locked away even from herself. The studio apartment where her canvases lay stacked like untold stories, the scent of turpentine mingling with memories. The walls wore layers of color, some vibrant, some muted, all fragments of a heart learning to heal. Ethan stepped inside hesitantly, his gaze tracing the bursts of cobalt and burnt sienna, the quiet chaos that revealed so much without saying a word. "Your sanctuary," he breathed, voice low with reverence. Naomi nodded, a shy smile touching her lips. "It's where I face the parts of myself I don't always want to meet." He moved closer, fingers grazing the edge of a canvas, a stormy abstraction with flecks of gold that caught the light. "It's beautiful. Like you." Her breath hitched, the compliment landing softly but firmly. I'm still figuring out who that is." They stood side by side, silence folding around them like a protective shroud. Then Ethan's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing naturally, as if the space between them had been waiting to be filled. "Can I see more?" he asked gently. She led him through the room, pulling aside canvases like opening pages in a diary. Each painting was a confession, a memory, a fear, a hope. With every piece, Ethan saw a glimpse of the woman she was beyond the polished exterior she showed the world. When they reached the back wall, Naomi paused before a large canvas still wet with paint. It was a portrait, not of a person, but of a feeling. Swirling shades of deep indigo and soft amber, colors clashing yet blending, chaos tempered by calm. "I call it threshold," she said. "It's the space between who I was and who I'm becoming." Ethan studied it, his thumb tracing invisible paths over her skin. "It's brave." She looked up, eyes shimmering. "I want to be brave, for once." And in that moment, the walls that once held her heart so tightly began to bend, just enough for trust to slip through. Later, as the city breathed its nocturnal lullaby outside her window, Naomi and Ethan sat tangled in each other's arms. The world beyond faded until only warmth, breath, and heartbeat existed. She whispered, "I never thought I'd let someone see the broken parts." He kissed the hollow behind her ear, voice steady. "Broken doesn't mean less. It means real." Naomi closed her eyes, letting the truth settle like a balm. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to hide the scars beneath her skin. With Ethan, she could be whole in a way she hadn't known was possible. Their fingers wove stories against bare skin, each touch a question, each sigh an answer. Time stretched and compressed, moments bleeding into one another, until she dared to ask the question that lingered in her mind's quiet corners. "What if this doesn't last?" He held her gaze, unflinching. "Then I'll hold you anyway. No conditions, no disclaimers, just a promise held in the stillness between them." The next morning, sunlight spilled through the curtains, painting golden halos around their entwined bodies. Naomi awoke to the steady rhythm of Ethan's breathing, how his chest rose and fell like a quiet tide. She reached for him, tracing his jawline, memorizing the softness that defied his usual steel. "Stay," she whispered. He smiled, the kind of smile that meant he wasn't going anywhere. And in that gentle surrender, they found a new language, one without words, but rich with meaning. Because sometimes love isn't about grand declarations or perfect timing. Sometimes it's about the courage to lean into the unknown, to let walls fall where they must, and build bridges with hands that tremble but never let go. Spring arrived like a whispered promise, gentle yet insistent. The city stirred beneath a softening sky, buds breaking through the stubborn earth, light shifting with new purpose. For Naomi and Ethan, it was not just the season that changed. It was the air between them, charged now with a delicate but unyielding resolve. Their relationship had settled into a rhythm neither had dared imagine possible. Not the reckless passion of first encounters, nor the complacency of comfort, but something infinitely more complex. A quiet revolution of trust, vulnerability, and steadfast presence. Naomi often found herself watching Ethan across the small kitchen table as he meticulously prepared their morning coffee. The way his brow furrowed in concentration, the slight tilt of his head when he caught her gaze and smiled like a secret had passed between them. "You never told me you could make a latte," she teased one morning, voice still thick with sleep. He shrugged, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. You'd be surprised what I learn when I want to impress someone. She reached across and caught his hand, holding it longer than necessary. The world beyond their window was already bustling, but in this moment, time slowed to the cadence of their breathing. The days stretched and folded over one another in quiet intimacy. Ethan began inviting Naomi to the firm, not as a guest, but as a partner in more than just life's private moments. Her insight into marketing strategies, her eye for nuance and detail, quickly made her indispensable. In return, Ethan began accompanying Naomi to her studio, sitting quietly in the corner as she painted, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply watching. He never pressed, never intruded. His presence was a steadying force, like the foundation beneath a rising tower. One afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the window panes, Naomi paused mid-stroke and looked toward Ethan. Do you believe people can change? He met her eyes without hesitation. I believe love can change the way we see ourselves. She smiled, a soft, bittersweet curve. I want to believe that too. Their conversations deepened, peeling back layers that had long been armored against the world. Naomi shared stories of a childhood marked by joy and struggle, the music her mother played on Sundays, the resilience learned in neighborhoods where hope was a rare currency. Ethan spoke of his past, the weight of expectations, and the silence that often followed success. They found solace in these shared truths, their vulnerabilities weaving a tapestry stronger than any facade either had maintained. The turning point came unexpectedly. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Ethan invited Naomi to a small jazz club in a quiet street. The music was smoky and warm, notes threading through the dim light like a whispered confession. They sat close, hands intertwined, bodies attuned to the ebb and flow of the melodies. At a quiet moment, Ethan leaned in and whispered, I'm scared sometimes that I'll lose you, that the past will catch up. Naomi's heart thudded, not with fear, but with understanding. She brushed her fingers against his cheek. We're not perfect, but we're ours, and that's enough. The months that followed tested their promise. External pressures rose. Work demands, old ghosts stirring, doubts creeping in like shadows at dusk. Yet, with every challenge, they found new ways to hold on. A glance in a crowded room, a note left on a desk, a whispered apology in the quiet before sleep. Love became their revolution, not loud or flashy, but profound in its persistence. On the anniversary of their first accidental meeting, the spilled coffee that had changed everything, Ethan surprised Naomi. He led her to a rooftop garden overlooking the city skyline, stars glittering like scattered diamonds. Candles flickered softly, casting golden light across her face. He took her hands in his voice steady but full of emotion. Naomi, every moment with you has rewritten what I thought love could be. You've shown me strength, grace, and the courage to be vulnerable. She smiled, tears shimmering. Will you continue building this life with me? Not just the dreams or the plans, but the messy, beautiful reality. Her answer was how she leaned into him, lips finding his in a tender and fierce kiss, a promise sealed beneath the vast, forgiving sky. Their journey was far from over, but in that quiet revolution of hearts, Naomi and Ethan discovered the authentic architecture of love. Not perfection, not grand declarations, but the daily, courageous choice to show up, to stay, and to build a world where two imperfect souls could finally be whole together. The early summer breeze carried a promise, a gentle, unspoken vow whispered through the rustling leaves of the city's ancient oaks. Naomi and Ethan stood together on the balcony of their shared apartment, watching as the sun dipped low, painting the skyline with strokes of rose and gold. The world below buzzed with life, but up here, everything felt suspended in a delicate stillness, as if time had paused to witness this moment. Naomi's fingers found Ethan's hand, intertwining naturally, a quiet declaration of everything they had come to mean to each other. She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the soft light, and saw not just the man who had become her partner, but the steadfast foundation upon which she could finally build her most authentic self. "This," she whispered, voice tender, "is everything I've ever hoped for. Not just the love, but the safety, the freedom to be me, completely." Ethan's smile held a warmth that words couldn't capture. "You've given me the same gift. In your strength, I've found my own. In your vulnerability, I've learned courage." They stood in silence, letting their hearts speak in the language only they understood. The journey had been anything but easy. Fractured pasts, lingering doubts, the slow dismantling of walls built and broken. Yet through every shadow, every stuttered step, they had chosen each other, over and over again. In the months since that night on the rooftop, life had settled into a harmonious rhythm, with mornings filled with shared laughter over coffee, afternoons marked by gentle encouragements amid work, and evenings wrapped in quiet moments of connection. Their home, once just a space, had blossomed into a sanctuary where dreams could be nurtured and fears laid to rest. Naomi's art flourished, colors flowing freer than ever, each brushstroke imbued with the love and resilience she'd found. Ethan, inspired anew, approached his work with a softened spirit, balancing ambition with presence, learning that success held deeper meaning when shared. Friends and family watched their transformation with quiet admiration, witnessing not just a union of two souls, but the creation of something rare, a love that healed, grew, and endured. One balmy evening, as twilight deepened and the city lights twinkled awake, Ethan surprised Naomi again. He led her to the park's heart, where they had first dared to imagine a future together. Beneath the boughs of a blooming magnolia tree, a simple table awaited, adorned with wildflowers and soft candlelight. Ethan took Naomi's hands in his voice steady yet soft. "I knew my life was changing when you spilled that coffee. I didn't realize then how much I'd need you, to challenge, inspire, and love me through every imperfection." Naomi's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and I didn't know how much I needed someone to see me, for all that I am and all I am becoming. He smiled, heart full. "Will you continue this journey with me? Not just as my love, but as my equal, my partner, my forever?" Her answer was a breath, a smile, a promise made without words, but felt deep in the soul. Chapter 2. They embraced beneath the starlit sky, a quiet testament to the foundations they had built, stronger than any structure, more lasting than the tallest towers Ethan had ever designed. Because love, they had learned, was not about perfection or ease. It was about showing up, every day, through storms and sunlight, through joy and pain. It was about the courage to be vulnerable and the grace to forgive. Most of all, it was about choosing each other, again and again, and building a forever from the fragments of their past and the hope of every tomorrow. Thank you for following Naomi and Ethan's story, the journey of two souls finding strength in love's quiet revolution. If this story touched your heart, Consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to continue exploring tales that celebrate the beauty of imperfect love and enduring hope. Your support inspires stories like this to come alive. May your story be filled with courage, tenderness, and love that builds foundations meant to last a lifetime.